So this is a video about Eddie Van Halen. So at the time of filming this, it's roughly the 2-year anniversary of Eddie Van Halen's death. Now, if you happen to be watching this video and not know who Eddie Van Halen is, he was an American guitarist. He played with the band Van Halen, and pretty much from the release of their debut album in 1978, he was considered one of the most important electric guitar players of all time. So to commemorate the anniversary of his death, I thought it'd be interesting to look at probably his most famous guitar solo, the guitar solo on Michael Jackson's song, Beat It. I want to try and avoid too much music theory in analyzing this solo. Rather, when we look at the various licks in this solo, I want to look at the way they draw on past players in really interesting ways and innovate based on those techniques. Because I think what makes Eddie Van Halen really unique in the history of the electric guitar was his ability to draw from the furthest corners of the guitar playing of the decades that preceded him to create a sort of new guitar language that was not only innovative, but also really commercially viable. And the Beat It solo is a particularly economical example of this. It's only like 30 seconds long, and yet it contains all the hallmarks of Eddie Van Halen's guitar style. So without further ado, let's jump into this solo. Okay, so let's dive right into it. The solo starts with a lick that sounds something like this. So there are basically two techniques at play here and two predominant influences. The dive bar with the whammy bar, which is when you just depress your whammy bar really low. There's really only one player before Van Halen who used that frequently in his lead playing, and that's Jimi Hendrix. And interestingly, Hendrix didn't even really use his whammy bar that much on his studio material. It was something he did a lot live, and often not even in solos so much as in like some of his more like free form, almost like free jazz noise improvisation sessions like at Woodstock. It really wasn't a technique that a lot of guitarists were using within their guitar solo vocabulary. Until Eddie Van Halen, that is, where he really makes it a central part of his playing. The other technique we have here with these harmonics, that's a technique that was pretty absent from rock. So those are called touch harmonics or harp harmonics. It's a technique we see a lot of in jazz and bluegrass, often in chord melody songs. You almost never hear it in the context of the solo. So for Eddie Van Halen to be playing this lick that has a sort of Jimi Hendrix inspired line right next to a more jazz or country inspired technique, it is really cool and really speaks to the way in which he really drew from the furthest corners of the electric guitar playing of the 60s and 70s to create something unique and very cool. Okay, so the next lick sounds something like this. Honestly, we could probably do an entire video on this lick because it features two techniques, the first of which is the technique that Eddie Van Halen is probably the most known for innovating, and that's a technique called tapping. So if you don't know, tapping involves using a finger on your picking hand to play hammer-ons and pull-offs on the fretboard. And the other technique he's using there is he's playing arpeggios. Let's start by talking about arpeggios. If you have a chord and you play each note individually, instead of sounding them all together, you're playing an arpeggio. It's a technique we see throughout classical music. Everyone from Bach to Philip Glass uses arpeggios. And arpeggios were starting to show up in rock music of the 70s as well. You hear them, for example, in Come Sail Away by Styx, in the outro solo to Hotel California by the Eagles, in the Dire Straits song Sultans of Swing, in the outro solo. Eddie Van Halen's innovation in tapping was not inventing tapping. Other players had used tapping. Probably the most famous example of a guitarist using tapping before Eddie Van Halen is Larry Carlton on the Steely Dan song Kid Charlemagne. He does something like this. So yeah, Eddie Van Halen's innovation with tapping was using it as a way to play arpeggios completely legato, to play arpeggios without using any picking, to just be playing it with hammer-ons and pull-offs. So to really give you a sense of what it would have been like to hear tapping for the first time, I'm going to play the arpeggios from the outro section of Sultans of Swing by Dire Straits back to back with the tapping from Eruption. So yeah, there's a really big difference between those two ways of playing arpeggios. There's something about playing arpeggios completely legato. There's a sound to it that was really unprecedented in the guitar world before Eddie Van Halen. And that really is captivating. I remember hearing that at 14 and it absolutely blew my mind. So I said that sort of continuous legato sound was unprecedented in the guitar world before Eddie Van Halen. That's not entirely true. There was one guy who was doing that sort of legato sound before Eddie Van Halen. And he was actually a huge influence on Eddie Van Halen. And we're going to talk about him when we look at the next lick, which is right now. So the next lick sounds something like this. Okay, so this lick really draws on the playing of Allan Holdsworth. So Allan Holdsworth was the guitarist I alluded to when I said that there was a precedent for the sort of legato sound that Van Halen was creating. Holdsworth was a jazz fusion guitarist. He's very well known in guitar circles, remains quite unknown outside of guitar circles, unfortunately. So the cardinal feature of Holdsworth playing is, of course, legato, but his playing also featured huge stretches. The guy had enormous hands. And Eddie Van Halen was a big Holdsworth fan. The two played concerts together. They exchanged guitars. This lick right here really wears its Holdsworth influence on its sleeve. Not only does it feature this huge stretch, but it's also super legato. So that's a pretty straightforward Holdsworth lick. I'll say this about it, though, which is really interesting. Holdsworth really loved to play exotic scales, very chromatic, jagged lines, whereas what Van Halen's playing here is the two most stable arpeggios within the key were in E minor. So Van Halen's taking a technique from this avant-garde guitarist, legato stretches, but he's giving it a more tonal, more pop-oriented harmonic vocabulary. I think it's a great example of how you don't always have to sacrifice listener friendliness when pursuing technical innovation. And that's one thing Van Halen was really good at. And this lick is a prime example of how he did that. Okay, so the next lick we get is a lick that sounds something like this. Okay, so there are two interesting things going on here, and there are two sort of influences you can hear in this lick. The first is Jimmy Page on the guitar solo to the Led Zeppelin song Heartbreaker. Page would do this thing. He would like trill over here, and then he would like bend behind the nut. Eddie Van Halen has on a number of occasions cited the Heartbreaker solo as a big inspiration on him. And you sort of hear that here. He's playing entirely with hammer-ons and pull-offs with his fretting hand, but then he's bending the notes with the whammy bar. So it's very similar to what Page was doing. The difference being that in the Page version, you have to move your picking hand all the way over here. So it makes it hard to connect this lick smoothly to other licks. Whereas in the Eddie Van Halen version, your picking hand stays in the same position. So it's very easy to then move on quickly to play other sorts of licks. So the other thing we get there is what's called a pinch harmonic. It sounds like this. Honestly, before Eddie Van Halen, I can't think of any guitarist who frequently used pinch harmonics or who even used pinch harmonics once. I know this video is all about the way in which Eddie Van Halen drew on diverse techniques from the 60s and 70s, but he might have invented this one. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, because the only example of pinch harmonics before 1978, before the debut of Van Halen's first album, that I can think of is there's a moment with a pinch harmonic in one of the lead parts to Hotel California, but I'm like 99% sure that was an accident. But Van Halen could do it consistently. He was probably one of the first guys to do it consistently. And from that point forward, it was essentially an essential part of heavy metal guitar vocabulary. Final lick sounds something like... So tremolo picking is a technique that had been around in the guitar world for a while. Probably its most famous use is on the Dick Dale song Miserlou. So yeah, a technique primarily known for surf rock. A technique that, if I'm not mistaken, as well is borrowed from Middle Eastern music. In any case, it's a technique we don't really hear appearing in rock guitar solos that often in the 60s and 70s. I think there's only one solo that I can think of that uses it, and that's Highway Star by Deep Purple, the guitarist being Ritchie Blackmore. But yeah, not a super popular technique to appear in guitar solos. That is until Van Halen. He used it all the time. It was definitely a staple of his playing. And again, I think his use of it here, especially with the E minor scale, illustrates the way in which he sort of combed through the 60s and 70s to find all these little weird techniques that players were aware of but weren't using consistently, and certainly didn't make a staple of their lead guitar language. And he combined them and he synthesized them into an organic, musically expressive, and commercially viable lead guitar language. What I just said was actually a pretty good conclusion to this video. It pretty well summarizes why I think it is that most guitarists agree the story of the instrument can't be told without a lengthy passage on Eddie Van Halen, whether you love him or hate him. I mean, that was just the guy's impact. As always, I'd like to give a huge shout out to my many patrons. You can become one of these patrons and get a shout out. All you have to do is subscribe to my Patreon. Yeah,